Dr. J. O'Shea is going to be talking about this specifically. I'm not going to go into it, but we look forward to her presentation. So that ends mine, and just like to thank you all for your attention. And let me just ask if we have Elizabeth Kahn in the audience. Elizabeth was going to introduce you, Jay. And not seeing her. Um, so let me do that. We're thrilled to have you back, Jay, because you've been at one of our prior webinars, and we so appreciate you sharing your knowledge. And particularly today's topic, these campaigns being launched by the meat industry seem so destructive and so, I don't know, evil to try and influence people in such a way when it's not good for their health to be overeating meat. But Janet, Dr. O'Shea is a professor at UCLA. She's has several areas of expertise. She is a food and politics professor. And also, I think culture is part of your background where you also teach. So those two are certainly huge when it comes to food choices. And let me just turn it over to you, Dr. O'Shea. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jane. And thanks, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to get to talk to you about food politics. So we're hearing a lot lately about how meat is back, how the so-called war on saturated fat and, again, so-called protein is over, and how that means that veganism has failed. We hear that a new trend, a so-called whole food move toward supposedly high quality animal protein, has sprung up in place of plant-based eating. And we're fed messages that this vindicates meat and shows us that the plant-based movement was misguided. There are a lot of problems with this idea. One is that the reversion to the status quo never justifies the status quo. It just tells us that there is a status quo. The other is that the plant-based movement didn't just lose ground. That ground was actively taken away. A new trend didn't just appear. Instead, the meat industry actively smeared efforts to shift eating patterns. In other words, if we look at Nicholas Klein, labor organizer Nicholas Klein's quote, "First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win," we are definitely at the they fight you phase. I've been in this movement long enough that I remember well the ignoring and the laughing. So at least we can say they're not laughing anymore. But let's take a look at some of the tactics the industry has used. So here's RFK Jr.'s infamous inverted food pyramid. You can see he positions meat, cheese, other animal products right up in the most visible top left corner. And we can also see that whole grains are at the very bottom and beans and nuts are virtually absent. This flies in the face of scientific consensus. And that scientific consensus has formed the basis of eating guidelines across countries around the world, which you can see in the examples of Canada and Japan's visual food guides. Chris McCaskill of the Viva Longevity YouTube channel, who's a climate scientist and earth scientist, he points out that RFK Jr.'s new inverted food pyramid still encourages the consumption of fruits and vegetables. And that's clearly a good thing. And so on the surface, this might look like some kind of compromise, but it actively discourages the consumption of legumes, nuts, seeds, and whole grains. McCaskill says, and I agree with him here, that this is because beans, nuts, seeds, and whole grains threaten the meat industry directly in a way that produce doesn't. They're hearty, they're filling, they're cheap, they can easily form the centerpiece of a meal, and of course they contain protein, which is a word that increasingly has come to be used as a synonym for meat, incorrectly. And again, this isn't accidental. So this move isn't new. It's a campaign that goes back at least a decade, if not more. And it all hinges on this one point, attacking alternatives to the centrality of meat in the standard American diet. So, what is this industry campaign? Well, like any good campaign, it has several fronts. The campaign has at least two sides: attacking whole plant foods as inadequate or even harmful, while also going after attempts to invite meat eaters in through the creation of new products that cater to their tastes. Interestingly, this campaign is not only about countering the threat, the economic threat that plant-based foods and particularly plant-based proteins pose to the meat industry, it also generates revenue in its own right. So let's take a look at some of these false narratives and some profit motives. So many of us probably remember the anti-soy hysteria of the late noughts and early 2010s. This focused on phytoestrogens in soy, and we all heard a lot about, oh, soy causes cancer, it causes reproductive cancers because it has estrogen, it's going to cause quote unquote man boobs. Well, this was based on studies in rats, and it was debunked multiple times with the evidence that in fact soy doesn't cause cancer. It actually protects against cancer. And that's because phytoestrogens work differently than animal estrogens. They actually are beta blockers. This idea was propagated by the Weston Price Foundation. Interestingly, they're a nonprofit, but they propagate, quite frankly, kooky ideas about saturated fat being healthy, about cholesterol not being harmful. They promote the consumption of full fat animal products. And sadly, they've had a number of prominent members die quite prematurely because of cardiovascular disease. It was also picked up by Joseph Mercola, who is a physician, but is also very interested in what is called regenerative grazing. Joseph Mercola subsequently recanted his anti-soy position and said, oh, well, I was only referring to soy protein isolates. I wasn't talking about tofu and tempeh, but that ship had already sailed. And interestingly, Joseph Mercola makes a lot of money selling supplements. So then we had the critique of beans. The beans are full of anti-nutrients, phytates and lectins. So where did that come from? Well, it came from a fad diet in Japan, where people were eating raw kidney beans. Not surprisingly, they were getting sick from doing this because eating raw dried beans is not exactly a good idea. One of the main proponents of that was Stephen Gundry, and not surprising, wrote a lot about lectins, and his book is called The Plant Paradox. And not surprisingly, he makes a lot of his revenue off of selling supplements and diet books. Then we had grains, the Grain Brain, the book The Grain Brain, various other publications, and one of the compounds that they were focusing on was gluten. There is the very real condition of celiac disease, which affects about 1% of the population. But from that, some of these authors extrapolated that gluten must have an autoimmune disease-inducing effect. It doesn't, but it did spark a huge sub-industry of gluten-free convenience foods. And then we had the attack on so-called seed oils and the argument that, in fact, the scientists have been lying to us, doctors have been lying to us, unsaturated fat is bad, saturated fat is good. The key issue that the people promoting this idea honed in on is that they kept saying, well, you can see there is a decline in publications saying saturated fat and cholesterol are bad for you. So that must mean that that's no longer the scientific consensus. In fact, that's not how scientific consensus works. It's actually the opposite. Once something is established as part of the scientific consensus, there isn't a need to keep publishing papers about it. So one of the main proponents of this idea of the idea that saturated fat is good for us and doctors and scientists are lying is Nina Teicholz. She's not a scientist or a medical doctor. She's a journalist. She's made a lot of money from her diet books, but also, interestingly, she has backing from an Exxon billionaire. So these narratives come and go. The anti-soy hysteria has largely disappeared, although it's still pretty hard to get soy milk in cafes and restaurants, so it's had its effect. lies tend to be compelling. Hence this quote of the lie is halfway around the world while the truth is putting its shoes on. It's attributed to Mark Twain, but he didn't actually say it. Um, Ideas that run contrary to common sense and to received wisdom tend to have an appeal, particularly in the United States. I think we really tend to celebrate the contrarian position. Um, but once an idea has landed, it's hard to shift. And that's where a social scientist or social psychologist, rather, Daniel Kahneman, came up with this idea of repetition makes truth. Like if we hear something enough, we tend to believe it, even if it has no basis in reality. As if all that wasn't enough, then came in another critique. It's processed. And this is one we hear a lot now, that, oh, plant-based meats are unhealthy, plant milks, sometimes even tofu. It's bad for you because it's processed. And sometimes we hear this idea that, oh, plant-based meats are worse for you than meat. They're not. And often this comes from people who are not raw foodists, but are in fact eating the standard American diet, which raises the question of what actually are processed foods, and are the people who are putting forward this critique, do they even know what processed versus unprocessed foods actually are? So this idea comes from the NOVA scale. It was developed by a group of scientists in Brazil. NOVA is Portuguese for new. And the idea was to categorize foods simply based on the level of processing, not based on their nutrient profile, not even necessarily based on how good for you or bad for you they are, just on their level of processing. And the scientists were interested in figuring out, is there something about ultra processed foods, highly processed foods? Is there something aside from the sugar, fat, and salt that makes them hyper palatable and that causes them to have adverse health effects? So that was really their research question. So Nova 1 is parts, as we can see here from the diagram, from the chart. These are parts, food entities that undergo basic kinds of alterations. Category 2 are additives that are common in regular cooking. So things like salt, oil, honey, sugar. Category 3 is where you add 1 plus 2. So they call it traditional methods, but things like canning, pickling. So a can of beans, for example, or a bakery bread. And then when we get to 4, Nova 4, we're talking about ultra processed foods. So these are typically additives that have some sort of industrial formulation. Sometimes it's foods that have been processed in ways to affect their aesthetic appeal, in terms of their texture, their coloring, etc. So this was quite a useful scale for what the NOVA scientists were trying to do, which was to explore this idea of what is the nature of these new products that have come on the scene in the last, say, 5 decades or so? And is there something about them that makes them hyper palatable? But this is the important part when we're thinking about meat industry disinformation. There has been a selective application of certain kinds of NOVA criteria to certain products. And there's been some inbuilt assumptions that are not actually accurate. So just because it's in group 1 doesn't mean it's healthy. Steak is in group 1. Theoretically, you could eat a puffer fish, which is poisonous, but that would be in group 1 because it's minimally processed. Also, there isn't necessarily a hierarchy here. So as we move from group 1 to group 4, you would tend to assume, oh, well, each one gets more and more unhealthy. But group 2 is things like sugar and salt. Group 3 is when you add 1 and 2. So clearly a can of beans is much healthier than just eating a handful of salt. Most group 4 foods are unhealthy, but not all of them are. So, for example, shredded wheat is in that category because the process of extrusion is something you couldn't do in your home, but shredded wheat is actually much healthier than a lot of other food products. The Nova scientists talked about the number of ingredients as a descriptor for ultra-processed foods. But for them, it's not a determining factor. So you could make a 15-bean soup with a whole bunch of vegetables in it, and that would be like a 30-ingredient food, but it wouldn't be unhealthy. So the Nova scientists talk about how a long list of ingredients is typical of ultra-processed foods. That doesn't mean something with only one or two ingredients is healthful, nor does it mean anything with a lot of ingredients is unhealthy. But it has been used strategically by the meat industry and by their paid influencers to say, oh, well, meat is a one ingredient food, so it must be healthy. The other issue is comparing like with like or comparing like with unlike. So when we get this response of, oh, Beyond Burgers, those are terrible because they are processed, what we're not hearing about is that a meat burger, a burger made from cow meat, is also considered ultra processed. So we have two different ultra processed foods. And when they've been compared in scientific studies, the people eating the Beyond Burgers had ended up with better health results, not surprisingly, because the Beyond Burgers have fiber, they have less saturated fat, they don't have cholesterol. And then the most important thing is that nutrition is a zero-sum game. Whenever we eat one thing, we're not eating something else. So the important question is, what is the food replacing? So to say, oh, well, Impossible sausages are terrible because they're processed. Well, if they're replacing a meat sausage, they're actually healthier. So some things to keep in mind as we try to tackle these misinformation and disinformation campaigns. Well, we have the truth on our side and we have data on our side. I think it's also important to recognize that for most people involved in the plant-based and the vegan movements, this isn't just a trend. It's a serious commitment. But also, just because we're at the fighting stage, it doesn't mean that we and the planet and the animals automatically win. So going back to that quote, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Nicholas Klein was a labor organizer. So he was talking about the need for resilience and fortitude. He wasn't automatically assuming that just because opponents are fighting, that a win is automatically around the corner. So then that leads to, what can we do in the face of disinformation, misinformation, and manufactured lies? Well, we can spread accurate information using valid sources. We can share our sources. Counter arguments don't necessarily convince people. So when somebody is putting forward an idea that they are convinced is true, to just fire facts back at them, often it will cause them to dig their heels in deeper. This is something that social science has established pretty persuasively. So instead, one tactic might be when someone's spouting disinformation is to maybe deflect to the source, like, oh, soy is terrible for you because it has estrogen in it. Oh, well, perhaps you're not aware that that idea was propagated by the Weston Price Foundation, which has pretty questionable beliefs. That might be one way of approaching it. Another thing to consider is that narratives and emotion are more influential than facts. And this is a little bit problematic because I was just emphasizing that we have the data on our side, and I think we should embrace that. But also, that's not necessarily what connects to people. So personal experience, narratives of change, narratives of empowerment, something that happened to oneself, how our own lives have been improved, or the life of somebody we know. And then my last suggestion is I'll circle back one more time to Nicholas Klein and to the labor movement. The expression hold the line is used in labor movements a lot, and it means to stay true to a belief system in the face of adversity. It's used often in relation to strikes, but it's also used in relation to building solidarity, to building relationships of trust. And this is really important to build supportive communities around our commitment to human health, the planet, and the animals. Sociologist Damon Centola argues that complex change doesn't happen through viral spread. It doesn't happen through a single point connecting to another point at a long distance. It happens through what he calls wide bridges. So repetition of information from people who are close to one another, who trust each other, and who have built relationships with each other. So in order to tackle disinformation, perhaps one of the best things that we can do is to build communities around shared information. Thank you.
Jay, would you like to take questions now, or would you rather wait? We could see if there's any questions from the audience.
Sure.
Let's look at the chat, or people can raise their hands. Mac, are you there?
Yep.
I'm just, I don't, I
So I
have all the
think
people.
yeah.
I don't,
Hi guys, if there's any question, please raise your hand. I can promote you as a panelist.
okay. Mac,
No
also, were
questions
you,
so far, Jane. So I think we can continue.
okay, did
Yeah.
Michael Moon, were you able to get him?
No, I think I don't know. He was not able to get in. So I think we can continue.
Well, Dr. O'Shea, thank you so much for that stimulating and somewhat sad discussion of some of the meat industry and how they are attacking, and particularly the food pyramid too is so hard to actually understand, but it doesn't seem good for the American public. So we appreciate your comments, and thank you again for joining us for the second time of our webinar.